The trillionaire
I'm
CEO
not
she
here to take
protected
anything.
never came back,
I'm here to
until a
give you
secret
everything.
forced him to find her. But when Ethan Blackwell finally arrived at Grace Miller's door after 6 years, the powerful billionaire heir wasn't coming to reclaim a lost love. He was coming to uncover a truth that could shatter everything he believed about the woman who had protected him. Grace was poor. Not poor in character. Not poor in heart. Only poor in circumstance. A caregiver struggling to support her widowed mother. She lived in a small apartment while serving inside one of the wealthiest families in America. Ethan Blackwell was the opposite. The future trillionaire CEO. The heir to global empire. A man surrounded by wealth, influence, and power, but blind to the danger quietly growing inside his own family. And somehow, it was Grace who protected him. She protected his grandmother's final wishes. She protected his family's future. She protected secrets that were never hers to keep. But instead of gratitude, she received blame. Instead of trust, she received heartbreak. And the trillionaire CEO never came back. Not after the accusations. Not after the painful separation. Not after Grace disappeared from his life, carrying a burden that would change her future forever. For 6 years, Ethan built a $1 trillion empire. But hidden inside a sealed envelope waited a flash drive and a video recording from the one person they both trusted most. A recording containing a secret powerful enough to force the trillionaire CEO to find the very woman he believed had betrayed him. But why did Grace willingly sacrifice her own happiness to protect him? What terrifying truth did his grandmother record before she died? Who benefited from turning the trillionaire CEO against the woman who protected him? And when Ethan finally discovers what Grace has been hiding all these years, will he realize that the greatest mistake of his life was walking away from the woman who loved him enough to let him hate her? 6 years earlier, Grace Miller was a woman the world barely noticed. At 26, she woke before dawn every morning inside a cramped apartment in Queens. The wallpaper was peeling in places, the kitchen faucet leaked constantly, and every month felt like a race against overdue bills. Across the hall, her mother, Sarah Miller, was already awake preparing tea. "You're leaving early again," Sarah asked gently. Grace smiled while putting on her coat. "Mrs. Blackwell has a doctor's appointment today." Sarah's eyes softened. "You take care of everyone, Grace." Grace kissed her mother's forehead. "Someone has to." The words came naturally because they had shaped her entire life. 14 years earlier, everything had changed on a cold October afternoon. A construction accident had taken her father, Thomas Miller. The memory still lingered. The hospital hallway. The smell of antiseptic. Her mother's trembling hands. The college fund that disappeared into funeral expenses. The dreams that quietly died without ever being buried. Since then, Grace had learned that survival wasn't glamorous. It was showing up every day, no matter how tired you were. An hour later, she stepped through the gates of the Blackwell estate. The mansion overlooked Manhattan like a kingdom built above the clouds. The Blackwell family controlled one of the largest business empires in the world. Private jets, luxury resorts, technology companies, investment firms, generational wealth beyond imagination. At the center of it all stood Eleanor Blackwell. At 82, she was still respected across boardrooms around the globe. Yet despite the billions attached to her name, loneliness followed her everywhere. Grace saw it daily. Relatives arrived in luxury vehicles. They brought expensive gifts, designer flowers, rare wine, custom jewelry, but most stayed less than 20 minutes. Their conversations rarely involved Eleanor's health. Instead, they discussed trust funds, board votes, future inheritances. Grace noticed things others ignored. The disappointment hidden behind Eleanor's smile. The way she stared at family photographs after everyone left. the silence that lingered through the mansion's enormous halls. That evening, while helping organize old photo albums in Alina's private library, Grace noticed one picture looked more worn than all the others. A 12-year-old boy stood beside Alina at a corporate gala. The edges were faded. The image had clearly been handled hundreds of times. "Ethan," Grace asked. A warmth instantly appeared in Alina's eyes. "My grandson." Grace smiled. "You must be very proud of him." "I am." Alina paused. Then her expression changed. Not sadness. Concern. A deep concern that seemed to come from years of watching something unfold. The elderly woman gently traced Ethan's face in the photograph. Most people saw the future heir, the future CEO, the future trillionaire. But Alina seemed to see something else entirely. "I'm worried about him," she said quietly. Grace frowned. "Worried he has everything." A faint smile crossed Alina's lips. "That's exactly what worries me." Grace didn't understand. Not yet. But as Alina carefully returned the photograph to the album, her eyes lingered on Ethan's image longer than necessary. And for the briefest moment, it looked as though she was preparing for a future she feared was coming. A future where the people closest to Ethan might become the greatest threat to his happiness. A future where someone would need to protect him. And neither woman realized that person would eventually be Grace. The following afternoon, Grace finally met the man Alina worried about. The arrival of Ethan Blackwell transformed the entire estate. Security personnel straightened their posture. Executives waiting in the foyer became visibly nervous. Staff members moved with greater urgency. Even before he entered the room, his presence could be felt. At 32, Ethan was already being called the future of Blackwell Global. Financial magazines featured him on their covers. Business networks analyzed his decisions daily. One day, he would inherit an empire worth hundreds of billions. Yet when he walked into Alina's library, the first thing he did was bend down and kiss his grandmother's cheek. "How are you feeling today, Grandma?" For a moment, the billionaire heir disappeared. Only a grandson remained. Grace quietly observed from the side of the room. Alina smiled. "Better now." Ethan laughed softly. "You say that every time." "Because it's true every time." The warmth between them surprised Grace. She had expected arrogance. Instead, she saw affection. But she also noticed something else. Exhaustion. As Ethan sat beside Alina, dark circles beneath his eyes became more visible. His expensive suit could not hide them. Neither could his smile. For years, Ethan had carried responsibilities most people could never imagine. After graduating from Harvard, he entered the family business immediately. His father, Daniel Blackwell, believed pressure created strength. Success was expected. Failure was unacceptable. By 25, Ethan was leading billion-dollar negotiations. By 30, entire industries reacted to his decisions. The world admired his wealth. Few recognized the loneliness attached to it. As the conversation continued, another woman entered the library. Vanessa Blackwell, Ethan's mother. Elegant, poised, intimidating. Her designer outfit probably cost more than Grace earned in several months. Her eyes landed on Grace briefly, then moved away, almost as if Grace weren't worth remembering. The slight lasted only seconds, but Alina noticed. So did Ethan. Neither said anything. Yet an uncomfortable silence lingered. And somewhere beneath that silence, the first seeds of future conflict quietly took root. Over the next several weeks, Grace settled into a rhythm inside the Blackwell estate. Every morning began with medication schedules, doctor's appointments, and long walks through Alina's private garden overlooking the Manhattan skyline. But somewhere along the way, their relationship became something neither woman expected. Friendship. One afternoon, Billionaire sat beside Grace in the sunroom, reviewing old journals she had written decades earlier. The pages contained memories of business battles, family celebrations, and personal losses. Grace listened attentively. Most people listened to Billionaire because of her wealth. Grace listened because she genuinely cared. That difference mattered. "You know," Billionaire said one day, closing a journal, "most people spend their lives trying to be important." Grace smiled. "And what should they be trying to become instead?" Billionaire's eyes softened. "Useful." The answer lingered. It reminded Grace of her father. Years earlier, Thomas Miller had often said something similar while helping neighbors repair fences or fix broken plumbing. The memory brought a quiet ache to her chest. Even after 14 years, she still missed him. Meanwhile, Vanessa Blackwell watched everything. From a distance, always observing. The closer Grace became to Billionaire, the more uncomfortable Vanessa appeared. One evening during dinner, Vanessa arrived unexpectedly. Her gaze shifted between Grace and Billionaire. "You seem to spend an awful lot of time together." Billionaire looked up calmly. "She's my caregiver." Vanessa smiled politely. Yet something cold lingered beneath it. "Of course." Grace immediately sensed the tension. She simply lowered her eyes and continued serving tea. But Billionaire noticed. And she didn't like it. Later that night, after Vanessa left, Billionaire sat quietly staring out the window. The city lights flickered below. For the first time, she looked troubled. Deeply troubled. As though a clock had started ticking. Then she turned toward Grace. "If one day I needed you to protect something important," Billionaire began carefully. Grace looked surprised. "Protect what?" Billionaire hesitated. For several long seconds. Then she simply said, "My family." The answer raised more questions than it solved. And neither woman realized that conversation would eventually change the course of both their lives. A month later, the Blackwell estate hosted its annual family dinner. To outsiders, it looked like a celebration. Inside, it felt more like a board meeting disguised as a family gathering. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway. Executives, relatives, and family friends arrived dressed in custom-tailored suits and designer gowns. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the grand dining hall. Every seat at the table represented influence, wealth, or power. Grace had never seen anything like it. Yet what surprised her most wasn't the luxury. It was the tension. Beneath every smile seemed to hide an agenda. Beneath every compliment lingered competition. As staff prepared dinner, Grace quietly assisted Billionaire. From her position near the room, she observed conversations unfold. Julian Blackwell, Ethan's cousin, spent most of the evening discussing investment opportunities. Another relative repeatedly brought up future trust arrangements. Several conversations somehow circled back to inheritance. Again and again. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Billionaire noticed it too. At one point, she leaned toward Grace and whispered, "Watch carefully." Grace did. And what she saw troubled her. Very few people asked Billionaire how she felt. Nobody asked whether she was happy. Most wanted something. Information. Approval. Access. Money. Across the table, Ethan seemed increasingly uncomfortable. Unlike the others, he kept redirecting conversations away from inheritance and toward family matters. But each attempt failed. The room always returned to wealth. As the evening progressed, Vanessa watched Ethan closely. Her ambitions for her son had never been a secret. For years, she had envisioned him marrying into another powerful family, strengthening the Blackwell empire even further. Grace fit nowhere in those plans. When Ethan briefly thanked Grace for helping Billionaire after a recent medical appointment, Vanessa's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Most people missed it. Grace didn't. Neither did Alina. Hours later, after everyone left, Alina sat alone in the empty dining room. The silence felt heavier than before. Then she quietly said something that sent a chill through Grace. "They're already fighting over things I haven't even left behind yet." And for the first time, Grace understood why Alina seemed afraid for her family. 2 weeks after the family dinner, something happened that neither Grace nor Alina would ever forget. It began shortly after midnight. The estate was unusually quiet. Most of the staff had gone home, and the city lights shimmered beyond the mansion's towering windows. Grace was reviewing Alina's medication schedule when she heard a loud crash from upstairs. Her heart immediately dropped. She ran. By the time she reached Alina's bathroom, the elderly woman was lying on the floor. Pale, disoriented, frightened. "Mrs. Blackwell." Grace rushed to her side. For a brief moment, she saw something she had never seen before. Fear. Not in the billionaire who had built an empire. Not in the legendary businesswoman feared in boardrooms around the world. But in an 82-year-old grandmother who suddenly looked fragile. "Don't leave me," Alina whispered. Grace squeezed her hand. "I'm not going anywhere." The ambulance arrived minutes later. At the hospital, doctors confirmed Alina had suffered a minor cardiac episode. Not life-threatening, but serious enough to raise concerns. Throughout the night, Grace remained beside her bed. Hour after hour. She never checked the time. Never complained. Never left. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Alina woke briefly. The room was dimly lit. Machines beeped softly nearby. To her surprise, Grace was still there. The young woman had fallen asleep in a chair beside the bed. Alina stared at her quietly. Nobody had asked Grace to stay. Nobody was paying her overtime. Her shift had ended hours ago. Yet she remained. Because she cared. The realization settled deeply inside Alina's heart. Later that morning, Ethan arrived from an emergency business meeting in Singapore. The moment he entered the room, relief flooded his face. Then he noticed Grace asleep beside his grandmother's bed. And for the first time, he saw her differently. Not as staff. Not as an employee. But as someone who had protected a person he loved. Neither Ethan nor Grace spoke about it. But Alina noticed the look in her grandson's eyes. And that same evening, after returning home, she made a decision. A decision that would eventually lead to a sealed envelope. A flash drive. And a video recording powerful enough to change everything. After Alina returned home from the hospital, something subtle began to change inside the Blackwell estate. Ethan started visiting more often. At first, Grace assumed it was because of his grandmother's health scare. But weeks passed, and his visits continued. Whenever his schedule allowed, he would stop by for breakfast, share lunch with Alina, or simply sit with her in the garden before rushing back to meetings. The business world still saw Ethan Blackwell as an unstoppable force. Stock markets reacted to his decisions. Television networks analyzed his interviews. Financial magazines praised his leadership. Yet Grace gradually discovered a side of him nobody else seemed to notice. He was lonely. One afternoon, she found him sitting alone on a garden bench after a tense phone call. His jaw was tight, his shoulders heavy. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Grace handed him a cup of coffee. "You look exhausted," Ethan laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" "A little." Smile that followed surprised both of them. For the first time, the conversation felt natural. Not employer and employee, not billionaire and caregiver, just two people talking. Over the following weeks, small conversations became longer ones. Ethan learned about Grace's father and the dreams she sacrificed after his death. Grace learned about the pressure Ethan carried every day, the endless expectations, the constant scrutiny. The impossible standards set by generations before him. One evening, while helping Alina organize important family documents, Grace noticed something troubling. Several relatives seemed to remember Alina's instructions differently. The same conversation would be repeated 3 different ways. The same promise would suddenly have 3 different versions. Arguments quietly followed. Grace hesitated before speaking. "Mrs. Blackwell, have you ever thought about recording some of these conversations?" Alina looked up. "Recording them?" "A video." Grace nodded. "So one day nobody can misunderstand your words." Room grew quiet. A thoughtful silence settled between them. Then Alina slowly smiled. "My dear," she said softly, "that may be one of the smartest suggestions anyone has ever given me." Neither woman realized it yet, but that simple idea would one day force a trillionaire CEO to find the woman he believed had betrayed him. A few days after their conversation, Alina asked Grace to meet her in the estate's private library. The request seemed ordinary, but when Grace entered, she immediately noticed something unusual. A small camera sat on a tripod near the fireplace. Several neatly labeled folders rested on the table, and Alina appeared more serious than she had in months. "You were right," Alina said. "About what?" "The recordings." Grace glanced at the camera. Realization slowly dawned. "You want to do them?" Alina nodded. "I've spent my entire life making decisions that affected thousands of people." She paused. "But the decisions that matter most involve my family." The first recording lasted nearly an hour. Grace helped adjust the camera and then stepped out of frame. The purpose wasn't to influence Alina. It was to preserve her exact words. Nothing more. Nothing less. As the camera light blinked red, Alina began speaking. "My name is Alina Blackwell." Her voice was calm, steady, confident. "This recording is for my grandson, Ethan." Grace quietly watched from the back of the room. A strange feeling settled over her, as though history was being captured in real time. Over the following months, additional recordings were made. Not every week. Not even every month. Only when Alina felt something important needed to be preserved. Between recordings, life continued. Yet Alina's trust in Grace deepened noticeably. She increasingly asked for Grace's opinion on personal matters. Not business matters. Family matters. That distinction mattered. Meanwhile, Vanessa Blackwell began noticing the change. One afternoon, she arrived unexpectedly and saw Grace leaving the library while Alina carefully locked away several folders. The brief exchange lasted only seconds, but Vanessa's instincts sharpened immediately. Something was happening. She didn't know what, but she knew she wasn't part of it. And Vanessa Blackwell was not a woman who liked being excluded. That evening, Alina placed a flash drive inside a sealed envelope. Then she locked it inside her private safe. The envelope remained untouched, waiting for a future nobody could yet see. A future that would eventually change Ethan Blackwell's life forever. As summer gave way to autumn, the atmosphere inside the Blackwell estate shifted again. Ethan and Grace were spending more time together. Not intentionally. It simply happened. A conversation over breakfast became a walk through the gardens. A discussion about Alina's health became an hour-long conversation about life. The more Ethan learned about Grace, the harder it became to see her as merely his grandmother's caregiver. One evening, they sat on the terrace overlooking the city lights. For a few precious moments, Ethan forgot about board meetings, investors, and billion-dollar decisions. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. Grace looked at him. "Regret what?" "Giving up your future." The question surprised her. Most people saw her present circumstances. Very few wondered about the sacrifices behind them. A flash of memory crossed her mind. The university acceptance letter she never used. Her father's proud smile before his accident. The dreams she quietly buried to help her mother survive. Sometimes those memories still hurt. But Grace smiled. "My father used to say that success isn't measured by what you keep. Ethan listened carefully. It's measured by what you're willing to give. The words stayed with him, long after the conversation ended. Meanwhile, Vanessa's concern continued growing. She noticed how Ethan's face changed around Grace, how often he asked about her, how naturally he trusted her. The situation was becoming dangerous, at least in Vanessa's eyes. Then, one rainy evening, Alina asked Grace to join her in the library. The older woman's expression was unusually serious. For several moments, she simply stared into the fireplace. Then she spoke. Grace, there may come a day when my family tears itself apart. Grace frowned. Alina. The older woman raised her hand gently. And if that day comes, I need you to promise me something. Grace's heartbeat quickened. She had no idea that the promise Alina was about to request would eventually cost her the man she loved. The fire crackled softly inside Alina's library as she looked directly at Grace. For the first time since they had met, the powerful matriarch seemed less like a business legend and more like a frightened grandmother. My time is running out, Alina said quietly. Grace immediately shook her head. Don't say that. It's true. The older woman reached for a folder resting on the table. Inside were financial reports, legal documents, and confidential family records. As Grace read through them, her stomach tightened. The deeper she looked, the more troubling the picture became. Several family members had accumulated enormous private debts. Others were quietly fighting over future inheritance arrangements. Hidden tensions were growing beneath the surface of the Blackwell family. Alina had seen it coming for years. If I leave everything directly in Ethan's hands after I'm gone, they'll surround him. Grace looked confused. Ethan is strong. He is. Alina nodded. But he's also good. The answer carried weight. A weight Grace didn't fully understand yet. Then Alina revealed her plan. For a limited period after her death, certain family trust decisions would pass through Grace. Not ownership. Not wealth. Protection. A temporary safeguard until the family stabilized. Grace stared at her in disbelief. They'll hate me. I know. Ethan will hate me. The silence that followed was heartbreaking, because both women already knew the answer. Alina gently squeezed her hand. Will you protect him anyway? Tears formed in Grace's eyes. Months later, Alina passed away peacefully in her sleep. The loss devastated Ethan. But the true shock came during the will reading. As lawyers explained Alina's arrangement, confusion erupted. Family members protested. Voices rose. Accusations flew. Then Ethan turned toward Grace. The hurt in his eyes was worse than anger. Much worse. He looked betrayed. Grace wanted to explain. Wanted to tell him everything. But she had made a promise. And promises mattered. So she remained silent. Unaware that her silence had just shattered the future she had secretly begun to dream about. The days following Alina's funeral became the darkest of Grace's life. Within weeks, Ethan stopped answering her calls. The distance between them grew wider. Then wider still. Every attempt to explain ended the same way. With silence. What Grace never knew was that Vanessa had quietly intercepted several messages meant for Ethan during those painful months. By the time the misunderstandings hardened into reality, the damage had already been done. Then came another life-changing discovery. Grace was pregnant. The moment she stared at the test result, fear and joy collided inside her heart. For several nights, she sat awake wondering what to do. Should she fight for Ethan? Should she force the truth into the open? Or should she protect the child from the family conflict, already destroying everyone involved? In the end, she chose peace, and disappeared from Ethan's world. 6 years passed. Grace raised a little boy named Noah. A boy with Ethan's eyes, Ethan's smile, and Ethan's stubborn determination. Meanwhile, Ethan transformed Blackwell Global into one of the most valuable companies on Earth. The billionaire heir became a trillionaire CEO. The world celebrated his success, yet a quiet emptiness remained. Then everything changed. While reviewing Aliner's private effects, a family attorney discovered a sealed envelope bearing specific instructions. Inside waited legal documents, a flash drive, and several video recordings. That night, Ethan sat alone as Aliner's image appeared on screen. "Hello, my boy." His breath caught instantly. For the next 2 hours, he listened. He learned about the promise, the trust arrangement, the sacrifices Grace made, the hatred she willingly absorbed to protect him. Then came Aliner's final revelation. If Grace is no longer beside you, the fault is not hers. A photograph appeared on the screen. Grace holding a newborn baby. The date beneath it shattered Ethan's world. The next morning, he stood outside a modest apartment building. When Grace opened the door, time seemed to stop. Neither spoke. Then a small voice came from inside. "Mom." A 6-year-old boy appeared. For a moment, Ethan forgot how to breathe. The child looked exactly like him. Tears filled Grace's eyes. Tears filled Ethan's too. And in that moment, the trillionaire CEO finally understood the truth. The woman he believed had betrayed him had actually protected him all along. And the greatest treasure he had spent 6 years searching for was not waiting inside a boardroom, a company, or an empire. It was standing right in front of him. His family. The family he almost lost forever.